Hey, what's up, YouTube? Guess what I'm doing this week? I had some downtime between bikes, and then, of course, I ended up getting a bunch more bikes in. So, I'm kind of piecemealing this together, waiting for parts to come in. But getting this LS swap together, I'm realizing really how far off that rear axle ratio is, and it's almost impossible to tune when I can clock about 90 miles an hour on top in a second gear. And the rear end was real sketchy. So I pulled the rear end apart. Trailing arm bushings were blown. They needed to be changed out. And a good opportunity to get the bat wing out and rebuild the rear diff, see how bad it was inside. I hadn't been inside it yet, so it was kind of an unknown. Trailing arms went smooth. I did energy suspension polyurethane trailing arm bushings. Got them all cleaned up, or more cleaned up and painted up. Bearings were in great shape. I had a did you know? Today I learned, and it's funny, back in the 90s, God, I worked on hundreds of these cars in a dealership. And I don't recall there ever being a grease fitting for the rear hub bearings. And where'd you go? Right down there. There's a little plastic cap on it, but you pop that cap off, it's a needle nose, and there's a grease fitting there. So you can actually, because these bearings are, have to be pressed apart and together again. And since they felt nice and smooth, they were just really free, like there was very little grease left in them. But I didn't feel any notchiness or wear on the bearings. It was nice and tight. The end play was good. So I'd rather not pull them apart if I don't have to. I got to get a rag because I got schmutz all over my hand now. I was able to just squirt some grease up in there. And they're nice and smooth, and the bearings are ready to go back in. So good stuff. So they're ready to go. And I got the bat wing out. Carrier bushings, the bat wing are in pretty good shape. I'm not going to worry about those. They're easy enough to change later if they deteriorate. But this has already been degreased and pressure washed out, and you can see it's just still a mess. And if I'm going to pull this thing out and apart and overhaul it, then I'm going to clean it up too. So I'm waiting for some aluminum stripper and some nice Alumacast paint to come in. And so I pulled the rear diff apart. Stub shafts are in good shape. A little bit of wear on the ends, not a whole lot. End play was still very good. I was pleasantly surprised to find. I mean, I had gotten back there with a pry bar, and it didn't feel like it had excessive end play. So I wasn't expecting much, but you never know what you're going to find until you get in there. And I got a set of 373 gears in from Motive Gear. The ring's obviously already mounted on the carrier, and I've got the inner bearing on the pinion. So these Dana 44 ICIs in the back of Corvettes are set up a little different than some other rear ends. Typically in a standard, like a GM 8.5, the carrier race goes on the outside under the carrier cap, under the carrier bearing cap. And what you would do is install shims in behind the bearing race, because they would stick out the other. You could pop the cap off and slide some shims in, but since this is an aluminum housing, they just put a race on the inside of the cap, and there's a little race or a stop on the inside of the housing. These actually take shims in between the inner race of the carrier bearing and the carrier itself, which makes it a real pain to set up backlash and your final pattern, because you've got to press these bearings on and off. These are press fit. So what I've done, and what I recommend doing for these, is get a second set of bearings, the same bearing you're going to use, in my case with Timken's, and you can actually take your time and sand or mill away. If you have a lathe, that's great. I don't have access to one here, but you can mill away a couple of thousandths off the inner race. It's only about, I think it was 3 or 4 thousandths. And basically I would grind away nice, and you're looking for not removing the most material, but in taking your time and making sure it's evenly removed. You don't want big high spots and low spots. So basically I would grind a little bit away, check it with a caliper, grind a little away, check it with a caliper. Eventually got to the point where I started to be able to get it to just slip fit, and then it would get stuck. So I took a little bit off, and now with a little bit of work, I can slide these on and off, but I don't have to press them on and off. So now I'm not worried about destroying my brand new Timkens that are going to go on there, and during the final carrier shim process. So I can set these up, check the backlash, move some shims side to side, get the preload correct, and then slip the bearings back on and get it just about perfect. And then I can slide these off, and I'll press on I will press on the final Timkins to go with the final install. The pinion's a little different too. The pinion bearing is actually nice on these because it does not take shims between the bearing race and the pinion head. These actually take it between the bearing race, the inner bearing race, and the case itself. So what I did in this case, and again, that's pressed in, not terribly hard, but it's enough that, you know, these shims are going to be sitting here between the carrier bearing race and the case. And so while you're driving this race back out of the carrier housing to set the pinion depth, you're banging on these shims and you're beating the crap out of them. And in fact, you can see this one's got a couple of nicks in it where the drift caught it. And, you know, you get them all wrinkly and you crush them, and it's not the way I want things done. I want to be nice. So I did the same with the race, basically. I went around the Timken race and ground a little off, and evenly around. Then I wire brushed it, so that's why it looks, you can actually see there is material there, even though if you catch it in the light, it looks smooth. Just a couple of thou, so that I can do the same thing. I can slip this down into the case. It's still a snug fit, but it's much easier to remove than having to drive it in and out. And set up the pinion depth. And once the pinion depth set, I'll swap this race out for my permanent Timken race to match that, and that'll go in permanently with the same shims, and that'll get that all set. As far as setting the setting the pinion bearing preload, these don't use a crush collar. They actually use smaller shims that go between the bearing races. See, there's the outer bearing races right there. So these shims will stack up inside and keep the races separated to give you the right pinion bearing preload. These are pretty cool kits. Trying to think who made this one. Might have been Motive Gear, but there's a whole complete shim kit with a new, you know, captured or prevailing torque pinion nut. You know, they're crushed nuts, so they're actually D'd out or triangled, so they don't back themselves off. New washer, new nut, and then an assortment of shims to go on the inside. Plus, since I was delicate in taking the old bearings and races off, I managed to save a lot of the old shims. So I'm in good shape. And so right now, today, actually, I'm just waiting for delivery from Summit with 2 Timken carrier bearings. What else? The Indian Pinner race, Timken race. My aluminum stripper, all that stuff. Here's the aluminum housing. And again, in good shape. Just dirty. Gross looking. You know, so I'm going to give this a good strip down. It's already been cleaned. It's saying pressure washed, but it's just never, you know, if I'm going to take this whole thing apart and put it all back together, I'm going to clean this sucker up. So the aluminum stripper should get rid of all the oxidation. I can give it a little brushing, wash it and dry it, and then I'll paint it all up. And then we'll start putting races in and setting it up. I know I didn't get the disassembly on video. It just was, you know, sometimes the mood suits me and I just start pulling stuff out. And so, yeah, the whole rear end came apart. And here I was thinking I was going to get a slowdown in the bike business coming up on Christmas now. But nope, phone's blowing up. So it's I've had to get a bunch of other work in and out in the meantime. So it's been apart about a week and a half now, which is good because it took forever for the parts to get here by Pony Express. And I don't know what else is new. I got a new pack of stainless. These actually came off of Amazon. Oh, can't think of the brand make. If I can think of it, I'll add it in comments. But they sell a complete kit for $35. That's all stainless trailing arm shims, new hardware. It's killer, man. For $36 to get rid of these old crusty. And notice I marked them passenger inner so I can keep the shim stack and keep the base setting. So when I do the reinstall of the trailing arms, I'll set them up at the same spacing as factory, and then I can check it from there. And if I need to adjust toe, I can adjust toe. What else we got? There's my Timken outer pinion. Just waiting for the race to get here. New front seal, new axle seals. Posi was in great shape. That was a good surprise. You never know, man. I was kind of expecting I'd pull this thing apart and the carrier's going to be shot and, you know, who knows what else. But the carrier's in great shape. Nice torque on it. Little bit of wear on the crossbar, but not enough for me to be worth swapping the carrier out, because you can't get these crossbars anymore. These have little snap rings that snap along the outside. See if I can get the focus. You see a little snap ring right down in there. So these have little snap rings on the inside instead of C-clips that snap over that pinion shaft. instead of a bolt driven through. The newer design carriers have a 5/16 or a 10 millimeter, 5/16 bolt with a pin that drives through and locks the end of the shaft in. But this is an original 82, and you use these little snap rings. The problem is that the stub shafts come through, and you have a snap ring that sits down on the pinion and grabs the end of the stub shaft. So then the stub shaft rides directly against the center pin. So that's the clearance I was talking about, the end travel, the end play on the stub shafts. And it was tight. It was only a couple thou. So I'm not, these can be really beat up, and you just don't know until you get them apart. The only sign would be just having a ton of end play on that yoke would be able to slide in and out of the carrier. And since the end play was reasonable, checking it in the car, I was pretty confident it'll be all right once I got it out and apart. And yeah, so I could save this carrier, and the posi plates are in great shape. It's got tons of grip. Wasn't a ton of metal in the bottom, and you never know, these cars get turned into burnout queens. But thankfully, with the stock motor, you could barely do a burnout with that little 180 horse Crossfire motor. Yoke plates are all cleaned up. Bolts are all cleaned up. Drive shafts are rebuilt with brand new Dana Spicer 1350s. There's camber arms are ready to go back in. So really, I'm just waiting for the final, get the cases cleaned up and get the rest of my bearing races here, and I can get this thing back together and set the pattern up. And I'll definitely document that so we can go through that on camera. But all right, that's it for now. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, what's up, YouTube? All right, my tripod is officially broke, so I'm going to be doing this sucker by hand. We're going to be getting the ring and pinion set up in this Dana 44 ICA. Case is all cleaned up and painted up, looking nice. Batwings over there, just baking away in the sun. Bearings, were good, and they were cleaned out good and then lubed so they wouldn't rust. Pinions. Now, you're setting a pinion depth in a ring and pinion. And essentially, pinion depth is measured from the center to the head of the pinion. So from the center line of the carrier bearings to the face of the pinion is the standard that we use to measure pinion depth to locate the pinion in the housing. Because the housings are not perfect. The housings can vary. So when pinion depth is originally set up, with the correct jigs and the manufacturing, it's extremely detailed measurements. And when you buy a ring and pinion set, they come as a matched set. And you'll see this one it's upside down, but it's a 268, and there's a 268. So this was a matched set that was set up, and it looks like this ring was set up with upside down again, 6 thousandths backlash, which is about right. I usually shoot for 5 or 6 thousandths. Pinion depth, as the measurement from the center line of the carrier bearing to the pinion face, varies from axle to axle. Each axle has its own standardized pinion depth. On this axle, it's 2.625 or 2 5/8, exactly to the thousandth. Now, housings do vary, and race lands do vary, and you'll end up with some variance, slight variance, a couple of thousandths between the pinion face and the carrier. So what they do is they typically undercut or overcut the bearing race seat so that you have room to use shims to be able to adjust a couple of thousandths one way or the other to get the pinion face exactly the correct distance that it needs to be from the center line of the carrier bearing in order to get the correct tooth engagement, tooth wear pattern. So you can see on my new pinion face, notice that's a 373 versus a 278, so quite a big difference in ratio. Less teeth spins faster, the ratio goes up. You'll see it's actually marked 2.624, which means this pinion face needs to be at 2.624 instead of 2.5, which means I need to add 1/1000th of shim width between the standard. The original pinion, or whatever, if this has been replaced at some point in its life, is a +2, which means this needs to be set at 2.627. So what I can do, and working in the shop, working in dealerships with factory ring and pinion sets, and I've done just a ton of those. And a lot of times what we do is just swap out, cut the old pinion bearing off, or in this case, since it's behind the race, we just punch the race out and pull the old shim pack out. And if you don't have any markings, usually you can use that shim pack. Will take up the difference, the overcut on the bearing that's made into the carrier. That will take up the difference and give you a good starting point. And then you can check your pattern and adjust from there. But 9 times out of 10, the original starting shim pack is going to work just fine because we're within a thousandth or two. In this case, we're 3 thousandths out. So this shim pack, if this bearing, if this pinion rather needed to have 2 thousandths more shim than the 6.2, the 2.625, and this needs to be one less. What I need to do is take away 3 thousandths of shim out of this shim pack, and that should give me a good starting point. And 9 times out of 10, that'll be perfect. You won't have to do anything from there, but you won't know until it's assembled. So what I'm going to do is measure these shims out, and they're varying thicknesses. As you can see, there's going to be, tens and eights and twos, and it might just be fives, like a stack of fives and a couple of twos. And so I'm going to get that ballparked in. So we'll see if we got a couple of thousandths on next. Just give me a second to get my caliper, and we'll see what we're looking at here. And I'm a jerk. I did the math backwards in my head. Since this needed 2 thousandths extra space, then essentially you take out shims for 2,000 to make up 2,000 distance to push this face backwards because it needed to be extra. It needed extra space if you think of it that way. This needs a little less space at 2,4, 1,000. So what I need to do is add 3,000 shim to the shim pack. I've taken the shim pack right here, got it all wiped down and cleaned off, get all any grit and oil off. You see some of the shims are a little bent up. Now that, of course, will get pressed flat when you put it back in. But if I have one in my shim kit that's the same thickness, I'm just gonna swap that one out. So let's see what thickness shims we got in this pack here. All right, so it looks like what we got here is about a 3. If I keep the caliper in view for you, a 5. 4.5, 5. Don't squish it too much. Yeah, let's say 4 or 5, and then these, and then 3 12s. I can squish that a little more, but I'll see if my caliper is still centered. Yeah, a little. So it's a weak center. So yeah, we got about 11 or 12. So it should work out to roughly 12, 36, 41, 44, or something like that. These are all about the same. So again, about 11, 12. Now we stack them all up together. Careful to stay away from where there's any bends or dings in it because you don't want the bend to change your measurement. So I'm just making sure these are all, I got a good clean spot to stack them and measure them. There we go. So we got about 45, 44, so that's about right. So essentially there's that much variance built already into the housing to allow your room to adjust with shims. So it's not like the housing is made with exactly the 2.625 spacing. They actually overcut it so you have room for a couple thousandths of shim pack in there so you can adjust back and forth because they know there's going to be manufacturing tolerances in the ring and pinion. And, if you ended up having to add more shims, let's say you had a gear set come out with a 2.620 and you had to put 5,000ths or 5,000 shim in there to bring the pinion face even closer to the ring gear, but the bearing wasn't cast to allow it. Or rather, if you go the other way, if you had a ring and pinion come out with a 2.63, they needed to add 5,000, take away 5,000 shims to move the bearing further away, to move the pinion face further away, and you didn't have enough room in the housing. You'd end up having to machine the housing to take that 5,000s off to make room because there was no room. Once all the shims are gone, there's no room to move that bearing further back. So that's why they produce the housings with a little bit of a wider spec to give you room to make up the correct pinion space. Had a customer call coming in, had to take off for a sec. All right, so we got so we're looking at this was a +2 on the factory and what looks like a -1 on the new one going in. So to reduce the pinion distance, the pinion face distance to carrier, I need to add 3 thousandths to the shim pack. So I'm going to take a look in my little, pack of goodies I got here. Let's see if we've got a 3 thou shim. Let's see if I can't balance the phone here. Stupid tripod. That feels like 5. Oh, here's the thin ones. That's about a 5. Oh, there's a keeper. So there's a 3. So I'll add that to my existing shim pack. And actually, since this 5 is pretty bent up, I'm going to put this 5 in there too. And then this was the bent up 12, right? Oh, no, that's another 5. What am I doing here? Oh yeah, that's right, because I took the other 3 out. So there's a bent up 5 and a replacement 5, and that's all 5s. That's right, because we just needed to add a 3. I don't want to take the original 3 out. These 3s are really soft, so I can. I'm just using my fingernail. I'm flattening out the edge of that shim, so that'll definitely get flattened out. So here's, I swapped out the 5. I took out the one that was really bent, because that's going to be a little harder to flatten out. And I put in a 5 out of the new pack, and then I added a 3. So we had, what did we have before class? We had like 43, 44 thou on the pack. So what do we got now? $47, $48. Yeah, to find a thin spot, because I'm getting, because none of the shims are totally flat, the used shims anyway. Once they get pressed in behind a race, they'll flatten right out. Here we go, 46, 47. 45, 46. Yeah, as I'm going around and hitting some of the kink in the shims, it's throwing it off by a couple of thou. Once that's pressed in, here we go, 47, 46. So that'll add 3,000. So that should get us that should make up our distance. So here's a 5 that was all bent. I'm going to throw away. And then we've got an added 3 and an added 5. The 5 took the place of the bent one, and then an added 3. And once that gets installed in behind the bearing gets pressed into the case. And then, of course, the pinion gets preloaded as well, which further presses the bearing into the case. It'll take care of any wrinkles in there. That's those guys. And here's my milled Dana 44 inner pinion race that I'm going to use to set this in, and that's going to go right down in that land right there. So the shims will go in first and then the pinion. There, that's a little better. I'll grab my shims. And then this should drop right in. Perfect. And again, once I torque down this pinion, it'll press this race back. And this is just some discoloration. It's not. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any junk on the bottom of that pinion, because again, I don't want to stack up any grit in there. I want that to be just want that to be just the shims, keeping the bearing raised, jacked off the case. It's just no good way to balance this phone, let me tell you. Why would you zoom in on like, pain in the ass. Yeah, pinion's gonna hit the table anyway if I leave it stacked up like this. I'm gonna lay the case back over and put the pinion in.